in the shadowed heart of St. Mary's hall door, where ancient stones whisper of a goddess's curse, a scream pierces the night at Ashenby Hall. A loyal housekeeper lies dead, poisoned by a glass of sherry meant for another. Was it greed, betrayal, or the wrath of a forgotten deity? Hercule Poirot, with his razor-sharp mind and little gray cells, steps into a web of lies, where every guest hides a secret, every clue points to danger, and a crescent moon pendant holds the key to a deadly truth. Who meant to kill, and who will fall next? Unravel the mystery in this chilling tale of murder, motive, and mastery.
Chapter 1. The Setup. In the waning days of autumn, the village of St. Mary's Hollow lay nestled beneath a veil of mist, its thatched cottages and ancient oaks cloaked in an air of timeless serenity. The Hollow, as it was known to its inhabitants, was a place where the modern world seemed to pause, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the quiet tolling of the church bell. Yet beneath this pastoral calm, a subtle unease stirred, like a whisper carried on the wind from the ancient stone circle that crowned the hill above the village. The Hollow was not a grand place, but it had its pride, a crumbling manor house, Ashenby Hall, home to the reclusive Lady Beatrice Vane. The Vane family had once been the beating heart of the village, their wealth built on wool and trade. But now only Lady Beatrice remained, a widow of 60, her days spent in the shadowed halls of her ancestral home, surrounded by relics of a bygone era. The villagers spoke of her with a mix of reverence and pity, for it was said that a curse clung to the Vane name, a curse tied to the stone circle where, centuries ago, pagan rites had been performed under the watchful gaze of a forgotten goddess. On this particular morning, October 15, 1928, the air was crisp and the leaves lay in russet heaps along the lanes. The village was abuzz with preparations for the annual harvest supper, to be held that evening in the great hall of Ashenby Hall. It was a rare occasion when Lady Beatrice opened her home to the village, and the event promised to draw every soul from St. Mary's Hollow, from the vicar to the dairymaid. The supper was to be a grand affair, with tables laden with roasted pheasants, apple tarts, and cider pressed from the Vane orchards. Yet beneath the anticipation, there was a sense that something was amiss, though none could quite name it. Captain Arthur Hastings, recently arrived in the village to visit his old friend Colonel Bantry, stood at the window of Bantry's modest cottage, gazing out at the mist-shrouded hill. Hastings, a man of 40, with a soldier's bearing and a kind, if somewhat guileless, disposition, had come to the Hollow seeking respite from the bustle of London. He had heard of the harvest supper, and, at Colonel Bantry's insistence, agreed to attend. Bantry, a jovial man with a ruddy complexion and a penchant for storytelling, had regaled Hastings with tales of the Vane family and their peculiar history. "They say the stones up there are older than the church," Bantry remarked, joining Hastings at the window with a cup of tea in hand. "The villagers call it the Circle of the Goddess. Some nonsense about a curse, of course, old wives' tales, but Lady Beatrice takes it seriously. She's been odd lately, they say, keeps to herself, muttering about the past." Hastings raised an eyebrow. "A curse, you say? Sounds like the sort of thing that would interest our friend." Bantry chuckled. "Oh, you mean Poirot. I dare say he'd have a field day with the local superstitions, but I doubt even he could make sense of the gossip around here. Still, it's a queer business. Lady Beatrice has invited the whole village tonight, but there's talk of trouble in the family. Her nephew, Rupert Vane, has been staying at the Hall, and there's no love lost between them." "Rupert Vane?" Hastings prompted, his curiosity piqued. "A young man about 30, with more charm than sense. He's been abroad for years. South America, I believe, chasing fortunes that never materialize. Came back a month ago, and from what I hear, he's been pressing his aunt for money. There's also the matter of the estate. Lady Beatrice has no children, so Rupert's the heir, but she's been cagey about her will. Hastings nodded thoughtfully. And who else will be at this supper? Oh, the usual sort, Bantry said, waving a hand. Dr. Hayworth, the village physician. Bit of a dour chap, but clever. Mrs. Clara Wren, the vicar's wife, who fancies herself the moral arbiter of the Hollow. Then there's Miss Eliza Finch, Lady Beatrice's companion, a mousy little thing who's devoted to her mistress. And of course the servants, Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, and young Tom Briggs, the footman. A few others from the village too, but those are the main players. As Bantry spoke, the church bell tolled 11, its mournful note echoing through the mist. Hastings felt a shiver, though whether from the chill or the atmosphere, he could not say. He had a sense that the evening's festivities might not be as straightforward as they seemed. The harvest supper began at precisely 7 o'clock, with the great hall of Ashenby Hall aglow with candlelight. The long oak table was set with fine china, and the air was rich with the scent of roasted meat and spiced apples. Lady Beatrice presided at the head of the table, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her dark eyes sharp despite her age. She wore a gown of deep green velvet, and around her neck hung a curious pendant, a small carved stone in the shape of a crescent moon, said to be a relic from the stone circle. Rupert Vane sat to her right, his handsome face marred by a restless energy. He was impeccably dressed, but his eyes darted about the room, as if searching for something or someone. Across from him sat Dr. Hayworth, a lean man with a pinched expression who sipped his wine with deliberate care. Mrs. Clara Wren, resplendent in a high-necked dress, cast disapproving glances at Rupert, while Miss Eliza Finch, pale and nervous, kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, moved silently about the room, overseeing the servants, while Tom Griggs, the young footman, stood stiffly by the door, his face betraying a hint of unease. The meal progressed with polite conversation, though an undercurrent of tension was palpable. Lady Beatrice spoke little, her gaze often drifting to the tall windows beyond which the stone circle loomed in the darkness. At one point, she touched her pendant at her throat and murmured something about the old ways, prompting a nervous titter from Mrs. Wren. As the clock struck 9, the guests were finishing their dessert when a sudden, sharp cry pierced the air. It came from the direction of the library, a room adjacent to the great hall. The guests froze, their forks suspended, as Lady Beatrice arose, her face pale but composed. She said, "Remain seated. I shall see what it is." She swept from the room, followed closely by Rupert and Dr. Hayworth. Hastings, his instincts sharpened by years of association with Hercule Poirot, exchanged a glance with Colonel Bantry and rose to follow. The others remained, their voices hushed, as if afraid to break the spell of the moment. In the library, they found Lady Beatrice standing over a crumpled figure on the floor. It was Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, her face contorted in agony, her hands clutching at her throat. A glass lay shattered beside her, its contents staining the rug with a dark, ominous pool. Dr. Hayworth knelt beside her, his fingers searching for a pulse, but his expression told all. "He's dead," he said quietly. "Poison, I'd wager. There's a faint smell of almonds." Lady Beatrice's hand tightened on her pendant, her lips a thin line. She said, "This is no accident. Someone in this house has committed murder." Hastings felt a chill run through him. The quiet village of St. Mary's Hollow was no longer a haven of peace. As the guests gathered in the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion, he knew that only one man could unravel the truth behind this grim tableau. "Colonel," he said, turning to Bantry. "We must send for Hercule Poirot."
Chapter 2. The Crime. The library of Ashenby Hall was a cavernous room, its walls lined with leather-bound tomes and portraits of long-dead Vanes, their stern gazes seeming to judge the scene below. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and wax, now tainted by the sharp, bitter tang of poison. Mrs. Poole's body lay near the hearth, her gray hair loosened from its tight bun, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The shattered glass beside her glinted in the firelight, its spilled contents seeping into the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked relentlessly, marking the time at 9:07 p.m. on that fateful evening of October 15th, 1928. Captain Arthur Hastings stood just inside the doorway, his heart pounding as he surveyed the grim tableau. Lady Beatrice Vane, still clutching her crescent moon pendant, stood rigid, her face a mask of controlled fury. Rupert Vane, her nephew, hovered nearby, his hands thrust into his pockets, his expression one of restless unease. Dr. Hayworth remained crouched beside the body, his fingers stained with the residue of the spilled liquid, as he examined the scene with clinical detachment. Behind them, the other guests, Mrs. Clara Wren, Miss Eliza Finch, and young Tom Briggs, clustered in the doorway, their whispers a low hum of fear and speculation. "It is cyanide, I am certain," Dr. Hayworth said, rising to his feet and wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "The smell is unmistakable, and her symptoms, convulsions, the rigidity, are consistent. She must have ingested it moments before we heard her cry." Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "Ingested it? In that glass, you mean?" She gestured to the broken shards on the floor. Mrs. Poole was not in the habit of drinking during her duties. She was a woman of impeccable discipline. "Yet here we are," Rupert interjected, his voice sharp. "Someone gave her that glass, or she took it herself. Either way, it's murder." He glanced at the gathered guests, his gaze lingering on Tom Briggs, who flinched under the scrutiny. Hastings stepped forward, his military training urging him to restore order. "We must not jump to conclusions," he said firmly. "The police will need to be informed, and nothing should be touched until they arrive. Dr. Hayworth, can you confirm the time of death?" "As near as I can tell, it was immediate," the doctor replied. "She collapsed no more than 5 minutes ago, likely as we were finishing dessert. The cyanide would have acted swiftly, within seconds." Mrs. Clara Wren, her face pale beneath her powdered cheeks, clutched her shawl tightly. "This is dreadful," she murmured. "Mrs. Poole was a pillar of this household. Who could have done such a thing, and why?" Miss Eliza Finch, Lady Beatrice's companion, let out a small sob, her hands twisting in her apron. She was always so kind to me," she whispered. "She didn't deserve this." Tom Briggs, the footman, shifted uncomfortably. His young face flushed. I was at my post, sir," he stammered, addressing Hastings as if he were in charge. "I didn't see nothing. Nobody went into the library, not when I was watching." Lady Beatrice turned her piercing gaze on him. "And yet someone did, Tom. Someone entered this room and left Mrs. Poole to die." Her voice was cold, but there was a tremor in it, betraying the strain beneath her composure. Hastings cleared his throat. "Lady Beatrice, with your permission, I suggest we move everyone to the drawing-room. The police will want to examine the scene, and we must preserve it as it is. Colonel Bantry, perhaps you could telephone the station." Bantry, who had been standing silently by the door, nodded. "Right you are, Hastings. I'll ring up Inspector Grayson in Netherby. He's a decent sort,
though I dare say this will be a bit beyond the usual village mischief." As the guests were ushered out, Hastings lingered, his eyes scanning the room. The library was large but orderly, its furniture arranged with precision. A heavy oak desk stood against one wall, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a small brass statue of a horse. A single armchair sat by the fire, a book lying on its cushion, a volume of local folklore, Hastings noted, with a chapter marked on the stone circle. The tall windows were closed, their curtains drawn, and the door to the great hall was the only obvious entrance. Yet something felt amiss, though he could not place it. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The guests sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting to one another as if each suspected the other of some hidden guilt. Lady Beatrice took her place by the fireplace, her posture regal but her fingers still clutching the pendant. Rupert paced near the window, his cigarette case snapping open and shut with nervous rhythm. Dr. Haworth sat stiffly, his hands folded, while Mrs. Wren whispered prayers under her breath. Miss Eliza Finch perched on the edge of a sofa, her eyes red-rimmed, and Tom Briggs stood by the door, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame. Hastings, ever the observer, noted the time, 9:20 p.m. He jotted it in his notebook, a habit he had picked up from his friend Poirot, and he also noted the alibis, as best he could recall. At 9 p.m., when the cry was heard, all the guests had been in the Great Hall, save for Mrs. Poole, who had been overseeing the servants. Lady Beatrice had risen first, followed by Rupert and Dr. Haworth, with Hastings and Bantry close behind. The others had remained at the table, or so they claimed. But the library was only a few steps from the hall, and the cry had been sudden. Could someone have slipped away unnoticed? As Bantry returned, his face grim, he announced that Inspector Grayson would arrive within the hour. "He's bringing a constable and a doctor from Netherby. They'll want statements from everyone." Rupert snorted. "Statements? What's there to say? Mrs. Poole was poisoned, and one of us must have done it, unless you believe in ghosts from that blasted stone circle." "Rupert, that is enough," Lady Beatrice snapped. "This is not the time for your cynicism." But Rupert's words hung in the air, stirring unease. The stone circle, with its whispered curse, seemed to loom larger in the room than the firelight could dispel. Hastings recalled Bantry's earlier words about the Vane family's history, tales of betrayal, greed, and a goddess's wrath. Could there be a connection to this modern tragedy? As the clock ticked toward 10, the sound of a motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Grayson, a stout man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense air. He surveyed the room with a practiced eye, his constable trailing behind with a notebook. The Netherby doctor, a thin man named Dr. Lyle, confirmed Dr. Haworth's diagnosis: cyanide poisoning, likely administered in the glass of sherry found beside Mrs. Poole. The glass, he noted, bore no fingerprints but her own, a detail that struck Hastings as peculiar. Inspector Grayson began his questions, his tone brisk but polite. "Lady Beatrice, when did you last see Mrs. Poole alive?" "She was in the Great Hall at 8:30. She was supervising the serving of dessert. I did not see her enter the library." "And you, Mr. Vane?" Grayson turned to Rupert. "I was at the table, like everyone else," he said. "I didn't even know she was in there until we heard the scream." One by one, the guests gave their accounts, each claiming to have been in the Great Hall at the time of the cry. Yet Hastings noticed inconsistencies, small hesitations, glances exchanged, hands fidgeting. Mrs. Wren insisted she had been speaking to Miss Finch about the church choir, but Miss Finch's nervous nod seemed unconvincing. Dr. Haworth claimed he had been sipping his wine, but his glass, Hastings recalled, was nearly full. Tom Briggs swore he had not left his post, yet his flushed cheeks suggested otherwise.
As the inspector concluded his initial inquiries, Hastings felt a familiar itch, the sense that the truth lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for a mind sharp enough to uncover it. He thought of Poirot, his friend's meticulous habits and unerring logic. If only Poirot were here, he thought, he would see through the fog of lies and half-truths. As if in answer to his thoughts, a servant appeared at the door, holding a telegram. "For Captain Hastings," she said, handing it to him. Hastings opened it, his heart lifting as he read the words. "Arriving St. Mary's Hollow tomorrow morning. Expect me at Ashenby Hall. Poirot."
Chapter 3. The Arrival. The morning of October 16th, 1928, dawned gray and damp over St. Mary's Hollow, the mist clinging to the rooftops like a shroud. Ashenby Hall stood silent, its stone facade looming over the village as if guarding its secrets. The events of the previous night had cast a pall over the manor, and the villagers whispered of murder and curses as they went about their chores. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was no less oppressive, with the guests confined to the drawing room under Inspector Grayson's orders, their faces drawn with fatigue and suspicion. Captain Arthur Hastings had barely slept, his mind turning over the details of Mrs. Poole's death, the shattered glass, the faint smell of almonds, the absence of fingerprints, all pointed to a deliberate act, yet the how and why eluded him. He stood now in the entrance hall, awaiting the arrival of Hercule Poirot, whose telegram had promised a morning appearance. Hastings glanced at his watch. 9:45 a.m. The train from London was due at the nearby station any moment, and Poirot, with his penchant for precision, would not be late. As if on cue, the sound of a motor car crunching gravel announced his arrival. The front door swung open, and there stood Hercule Poirot, resplendent in a neatly tailored suit, his patent leather shoes gleaming despite the muddy lane. His mustache, waxed to perfection, framed a face both serene and alert, his green eyes darting about the hall with the keenness of a hawk. Behind him, a porter struggled with an assortment of valises, each stamped with Poirot's initials. "My dear Hastings," Poirot exclaimed, clasping his friend's hand, "it is good to see you, though I regret the circumstances. A murder, you say, in this charming village? Mon Dieu, the English countryside, it never fails to surprise." Hastings managed a wry smile. "You've arrived just in time, Poirot. It's a nasty business. Mrs. Poole, the housekeeper, poisoned last night during the harvest supper. Cyanide, they think. The police are here, but I fear they're out of their depth." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Cyanide, a most theatrical choice, and in a glass of sherry, you say. Tell me, Hastings, what is the mood in this house? Who are these people who dine and die under one roof?" Hastings recounted the events of the previous evening, describing the guests, Lady Beatrice Vane, Rupert Vane, Dr. Hayworth, Mrs. Clara Wren, Miss Eliza Finch, and Tom Briggs, and the peculiar tension that had hung over the supper. He mentioned the stone circle and the whispered curse, though he expected Poirot to dismiss such talk as superstition. To his surprise, Poirot listened intently, his head tilted. "A curse, you say? Most interesting. The human mind, Hastings, it clings to such tales when logic fails. But we shall see. First, I must meet this Lady Beatrice and inspect the scene of the crime. Lead on, mon ami." They proceeded to the drawing-room, where the guests sat in uneasy silence, watched by a young constable who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Lady Beatrice rose as Poirot entered, her bearing regal despite the strain in her eyes. "You must be Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending a hand. "Captain Hastings spoke of you. I trust you can bring clarity to this dreadful affair." Poirot bowed, his manner impeccable. "Madame, I am at your service. The death of your housekeeper is a tragedy, and Hercule Poirot does not rest until the truth is revealed. May I see the library where this misfortune occurred?" Lady Beatrice nodded, leading the way, with Hastings and Poirot in tow. The library was as it had been the previous night, save for a chalk outline where Mrs. Poole's body had lain. The shattered glass had been removed by the police for analysis, but the dark stain on the rug remained, a grim reminder of the crime. Poirot moved with deliberate care, his small frame bending to examine the rug, the armchair, the desk, and the open book of folklore. He paused at the windows, testing their latches, then turned to the door, noting its position relative to the great hall. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said, addressing Lady Beatrice, "this library, it has but one entrance, yes, and it was through this door that you entered upon hearing the cry?" "Yes, the door was ajar, as it is often during gatherings. Mrs. Poole must have entered just before her death, though I cannot say why." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And the glass of sherry, where did it come from? Was it served with the meal?" Lady Beatrice hesitated. "The sherry was kept in the dining room, on a sideboard. Mrs. Poole would not have taken a glass without reason. She was not given to drinking." Poirot nodded, his fingers stroking his mustache. "Most curious. And you, madame, you wear a pendant, a crescent moon, n'est-ce pas? It is connected to this stone circle, perhaps." Her hand flew to the pendant, her lips tightening. "It is a family heirloom," she said curtly. "The stone circle is part of our history, nothing more." Poirot inclined his head, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of interest. He turned to Hastings. "Hastings, my friend, you were present when the cry was heard. Tell me precisely what you saw and heard." Hastings recounted the moment, the cry at 9 p.m., Lady Beatrice's swift departure, followed by Rupert and Dr. Haworth, then himself and Bantry. The others, he noted, had remained at the table, though he could not be certain of their movements in the chaos. Poirot listened, his expression unreadable, then asked to speak with each guest in turn. Inspector Grayson, who had joined them in the library, bristled slightly at Poirot's involvement, but agreed to let him assist, provided he shared his findings. "We've taken statements, and the glass is being tested for cyanide. No fingerprints, though, which is odd. We're searching the house for the source of the poison." "Excellent," Poirot said, his tone polite but firm. "But it is not enough to find the poison, Inspector. We must find the mind that wielded it. I shall begin with the interviews. Hastings, you will take notes, yes?" They returned to the drawing-room, where Poirot began his interviews with his characteristic blend of charm and precision. First was Rupert Vane, who slouched in his chair, his eyes wary. "I was at the table, as I told the inspector. I didn't see Mrs. Poole leave, and I certainly didn't follow her. Why would I? She was just the housekeeper." Poirot's smile was thin. "And yet, monsieur, you are the heir to this estate, are you not? A man with debts, perhaps? Mrs. Poole, she knew much of this household's secrets, I think." Rupert flushed. "That's nonsense. I had no quarrel with her." Next was Dr. Haworth, whose calm demeanor seemed strained under Poirot's scrutiny. "I was drinking my wine when the cry came. I followed Lady Beatrice to the library and confirmed the poison. I've seen cyanide cases before. Hospital work, you know." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And you noticed the smell of almonds, doctor. A keen observation. Tell me, were you close to Mrs. Poole? A professional interest, perhaps?" Haworth stiffened. She was a patient, nothing more. Mrs. Clara Wren was next, her voice trembling with indignation. "I was discussing the choir with Miss Finch.
she insisted. "This is a godly house, Monsieur Poirot. Such wickedness is unthinkable." Miss Eliza Finch, when questioned, could barely meet Poirot's gaze. I was with Mrs. Wren," she stammered. "Mrs. Poole was so kind. I can't imagine who would do this." Tom Briggs, the footman, was last, his nervousness palpable. I was at my post, sir. I swear I didn't see nobody go into the library." Poirot thanked each in turn, his manner unfailingly polite, but Hastings knew that behind those green eyes his friend's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of truth hidden in their words. As the interviews concluded, Poirot drew Hastings aside. "Hastings, my friend, this is a puzzle most intricate. The glass with no fingerprints, the cry at precisely 9, the alibis that align too neatly. There is a pattern here, but it is obscured. We must look to the little details, the contradictions, and this curse of the goddess, it is not to be dismissed, not yet." As the clock struck noon, Poirot announced his intention to examine the stone circle on the hill. "The past, Hastings, it speaks to the present. Let us see what these ancient stones have to say."
Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The mist had lifted by midday, revealing the stark beauty of the stone circle atop the hill above St. Mary's Hollow. The ancient monoliths, weathered and moss-covered, stood in a rough oval, their shadows stretching long across the grass in the pale October sunlight. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat buttoned against the chill, paced slowly around the circle, his eyes scanning the ground, the stones, and the distant silhouette of Ashenby Hall below. Captain Arthur Hastings followed, notebook in hand, though he felt a touch out of place amid the eerie quiet of the site. "Mon Dieu, Hastings," Poirot said, pausing to touch a stone's rough surface. "These relics, they carry the weight of centuries. The villagers speak of a curse, and while Hercule Poirot does not believe in such things, he knows the power of belief. It drives men and women to act in ways most irrational." Hastings frowned, glancing at the manor. "You think this curse is connected to Mrs. Poole's death? It seems far-fetched, Poirot. Cyanide in a sherry glass isn't exactly pagan ritual." Poirot's mustache twitched in a faint smile. "Perhaps not, mon ami, but the mind that kills is often swayed by symbols. This stone circle, it looms large in the imagination of St. Mary's Hollow. We must understand its place in the story." He turned, gesturing toward the path back to the hall. "But come, we have questioned the stones, and now we must question the living. Their words will reveal more than their alibis suggest." Back at Ashenby Hall, Poirot gathered the guests in the drawing room for a more thorough round of interviews. Inspector Grayson, though initially skeptical of Poirot's methods, had agreed to let him take the lead, provided he shared his findings. The constable stood by the door, his pencil poised, while the guests sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The clock on the mantel read 2:15 p.m., its steady ticking a reminder of time's relentless march. Poirot began with Lady Beatrice Vane, whose composure remained unshaken despite the previous night's horror. She sat erect, her crescent moon pendant glinting at her throat, her dark eyes fixed on Poirot with a mixture of respect and wariness. "Madame," Poirot said, his tone gentle but probing, "you have said that Mrs. Poole was a woman of discipline, not given to drinking. Yet she was found with a glass of sherry, poisoned with cyanide. Tell me,
Was there any reason she might have entered the library alone during the supper? Her fingers tightened briefly on her pendant. Mrs. Poole was overseeing the servants, as was her duty. She may have gone to the library to fetch something, a book perhaps, or to check the fire. The library is often used by guests during such events, though I cannot say why she took the sherry. Poirot nodded, his eyes narrowing. And this pendant, madame, it is a family heirloom, you say? Connected to the stone circle? Her lips thinned. It is a vain tradition, nothing more. The circle has been on our land for centuries. The pendant is merely a keepsake, a reminder of our history. Most interesting, Poirot murmured, making a mental note. He turned to Rupert Vane, who lounged in his chair, his cigarette case open on the table before him. Monsieur Vane, you are the heir to this estate, are you not? And yet I hear whispers of debts, of a life spent chasing fortunes abroad. Did Mrs. Poole, perhaps, know something of your affairs that made her a threat? Rupert's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing. That's absurd, Poirot. Mrs. Poole was the housekeeper, not my confidant. I barely spoke to her. As for debts, what man doesn't have a few? I've done nothing wrong. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. We shall see, monsieur. The truth, it has a way of revealing itself. He moved on to Dr. Hayworth, whose lean frame seemed taut with tension. Doctor, you were quick to identify the cyanide. Tell me, have you access to such a poison in your medical practice? Hayworth's eyes flickered with unease. Cyanide is not uncommon in medical settings, Monsieur Poirot, but I keep no such thing in my bag. My work is to heal, not to harm. I noticed the smell because I've encountered it before in my training, that's all. And your relationship with Mrs. Poole, you said she was a patient. Did she confide in you about the household, perhaps about tensions with others? She was a private woman, Hayworth replied curtly. She spoke of her duties, nothing more. Mrs. Clara Wren, the vicar's wife, was next, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Monsieur Poirot, I assure you, I was with Miss Finch at the table when the cry came. This house has fallen under a shadow, perhaps the curse of the old goddess. I warned Lady Beatrice against such pagan relics. Poirot's eyebrows rose. You believe in this curse, madame? Tell me, what do you know of it? Mrs. Wren hesitated, her cheeks flushing. Only what the villagers say, that the Vanes angered the goddess centuries ago, and her wrath lingers. Mrs. Poole, she was always respectful of the old ways. Perhaps someone resented that. Miss Eliza Finch, when questioned, seemed on the verge of tears. I was with Mrs. Wren, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Poole was so kind to me. She taught me how to manage the household. I can't believe anyone would hurt her. Poirot's gaze softened, but his questions were relentless. Mademoiselle, you are close to Lady Beatrice. Did Mrs. Poole ever speak of disputes in the household, perhaps about Monsieur Rupert or the estate? Eliza's eyes darted to Lady Beatrice, then back to Poirot. She mentioned Rupert's return. She said it upset Lady Beatrice, but nothing specific. I don't know more. Finally, Poirot turned to Tom Briggs, the young footman, whose face was pale and slick with sweat. Monsieur Briggs, you were at your post, yes? Yet the library is but a few steps away. Did you see anyone approach the door before the cry? No, sir, Tom stammered. I was by the hall, watching the guests. Nobody went in, I swear. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And yet, someone did. The glass, it did not poison itself. Tell me, did you serve the sherry that evening? Tom nodded vigorously. Yes, sir, but I poured it from the decanter on the sideboard, same as everyone drank from. I didn't touch no poison. As the interviews concluded, Poirot drew Hastings aside, his expression thoughtful. Hastings, my friend, do you notice the pattern? Each alibi is precise, yet they overlap too neatly, like a play rehearsed. And the sherry, why did Mrs. Poole take it? She was not a drinker, yet she held a glass with no fingerprints but her own. This is a puzzle of the mind, not just of the body. Hastings frowned. You think they're lying? All of them? Not all, perhaps, Poirot said, tapping his temple. But some. The little gray cells, they tell me there is a contradiction here, a detail that does not fit. We must look closer, at the times, the movements, the motives. And this pendant of Lady Beatrice, it is more than a trinket, I think. Poirot requested a tour of the house, accompanied by Lady Beatrice and Inspector Grayson. They examined the dining room, where the sherry decanter was still sitting on the sideboard, its contents now under police guard. Poirot paused at the sideboard, sniffing the decanter delicately. No cyanide here, he murmured. The poison was added to the glass, not the decanter. But how, and by whom? They moved to Mrs. Poole's quarters, a small room off the servants' hall. It was Spartan, with a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a desk bearing a few personal items, a photograph of a young woman, perhaps a daughter, a worn Bible, and a notebook filled with household accounts. Poirot flipped through the notebook, his eyes narrowing at a series of cryptic entries. R.V. asks for funds. Refused. R.B. speak.
Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the tall windows of Ashenby Hall, casting long shadows across the drawing-room, where the guests remained under the watchful eye of Inspector Grayson's constable. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, each person glancing at the others with a mixture of suspicion and unease. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The evening of October 16th, 1928 settled over Ashenby Hall with a heavy stillness, the kind that follows a storm yet promises another. The great house, with its creaking floors and shadowed corners, seemed to hold its breath as the investigation into Mrs. Poole's murder deepened. Hercule Poirot sat in the library, his small frame dwarfed by the high-backed armchair near the hearth, his eyes fixed on the open book of folklore that had been found beside the housekeeper's body. The clock on the mantel read 7:15 p.m., its steady ticking a counterpoint to the tension that gripped the household. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the window, watching the last light fade over the stone circle on the hill. He had seen Poirot in this mood before, silent, contemplative, his mind sifting through details like a jeweler examining facets of a gem. The discovery of cyanide traces in the sherry decanter had shifted the investigation, suggesting that the poison was not an impulsive act, but a calculated one. Yet the question remained, why had only Mrs. Poole been affected, when the entire party had drunk from the same decanter? Poirot closed the book with a soft thud, his fingers lingering on the cover. "Hastings, mon ami," he said, his voice low, "the truth, it hides in the smallest of details. This book, it is not merely a prop. It was open to a passage about the stone circle, a tale of a goddess's curse, yes? But look here." He opened the book again, pointing to a faint pencil mark in the margin, a tiny arrow beside a paragraph describing a ritual involving a crescent moon. Hastings peered over his shoulder. "You think Mrs. Poole marked it, or someone else?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "That is the question, is it not? Mrs. Poole was a practical woman, not given to superstition, yet this book was in her hand, or placed there. The mark, it is precise, deliberate. It draws at her attention to the crescent moon, much like the pendant worn by Lady Beatrice. This is no coincidence, Hastings. It is a clue, a thread in the tapestry of this crime." Before Hastings could respond, Inspector Grayson entered, his mustache bristling with impatience. "Monsieur Poirot, we've searched the servants' quarters again. Nothing new, except a few letters in Mrs. Poole's desk. Family matters, nothing suspicious. The decanter has been sent for further analysis, but it'll take days. Have you found anything?" Poirot rose, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Inspector, I have found a detail most curious. This book, it speaks of rituals and curses, but it also speaks of intent. Someone wishes us to look at the stone circle, to think of the past. But I, Hercule Poirot, am concerned with the present. Let us return to the drawing-room. I wish to observe our suspects once more." In the drawing-room, the guests sat in strained silence, their nerves frayed by the day's interrogations. Lady Beatrice, her pendant glinting in the lamplight, sat by the fire, her face a mask of composure. Rupert Vane paced near the window, his cigarette smoke curling upward. Dr. Haworth sipped tea with deliberate calm, while Mrs. Clara Wren clutched a prayer book, her lips moving silently. Eliza Finch sat hunched, her eyes darting nervously, and Tom Briggs stood by the door, his youthful face pale. Poirot took his place at the center of the room, his manner deceptively mild. "Messieurs et mesdames, the death of Mrs. Poole is a puzzle, but it is one that yields to logic. Let us consider the sherry decanter. Traces of cyanide were found within it, yet only Mrs. Poole died. How is this possible? The answer lies in timing and opportunity. Tell me, who among you approached the sideboard before the supper began?" A murmur of protest rose, but Poirot raised a hand. "Do not deny, I beg. The sideboard was near the library door, accessible to all. Monsieur Briggs, you poured the sherry. Did you notice anyone near the decanter before you served?" Tom's Adam's apple bobbed. I set out the glasses at 6, sir, before the guests arrived. The decanter was already there, filled by Mrs. Poole. I didn't see anyone touch it." Poirot's eyes shifted to Lady Beatrice. "Madame, as mistress of the house, did you oversee the preparations for the supper?"
"I did," she replied, her voice steady. "Mrs. Poole managed the details, as always. I trusted her implicitly. The sherry was from our cellar, a fine vintage. I cannot imagine how it was tampered with." Poirot nodded, then turned to Rupert. "Monsieur Vane, you were seen near the sideboard earlier in the evening, were you not? Perhaps fetching a glass for yourself?" Rupert's eyes narrowed. "I might have been, but so what? I didn't touch the decanter. I was getting a brandy, if you must know." "Most interesting," Poirot said, his tone light but probing. "And you, Dr. Haworth, as a man of science, you would know how to handle a poison like cyanide. Did you have occasion to pass the sideboard?" Haworth's jaw tightened. "I was in the great hall all evening, as I've said. I had no reason to approach the decanter." Mrs. Wren spoke up, her voice sharp. "Monsieur Poirot, this is absurd. You're accusing us all. I was nowhere near the sideboard. I was arranging flowers with Miss Finch." Eliza nodded quickly. "Yes, we were together, by the window." Poirot's eyes lingered on her, noting the tremble in her hands. "Mademoiselle Finch, you are devoted to Lady Beatrice, yes? Did Mrs. Poole ever speak of the pendant or the stone circle in your presence?" Eliza's cheeks flushed. She mentioned it once, sir. She said it was a heavy burden for Lady Beatrice, but nothing more." Poirot's mustache twitched. "A burden, you say? Most intriguing." He turned to the group, his voice rising slightly. "There is a detail, mes amis, that does not fit. The glass in Mrs. Poole's hand, it bore only her fingerprints, yet the poison was in the decanter. This suggests a sleight of hand, a moment of distraction. I ask you to recall 8:59 p.m. precisely. What was happening in the great hall?" A tense silence followed. Mrs. Wren spoke first, her voice hesitant. "I was talking to Miss Finch about the choir, as I said. The dessert was being served." Rupert shrugged. "I was eating, joking with Dr. Haworth about the cider." Haworth nodded. "Yes, we were discussing the local brew. Nothing out of the ordinary." Poirot's eyes settled on Tom Briggs. "And you, Monsieur Briggs, you were at your post, yes, but you admitted to looking away. What distracted you?" Tom's face reddened. "It was the dessert tray, sir. One of the maids dropped a spoon, and I bent to pick it up. Just for a moment." Poirot's eyes lit up. "A moment! Mon Dieu, how often a moment changes everything! In that instant, someone could have slipped to the sideboard, or even to the library. The spoon, Monsieur Briggs, where was it dropped?" "Near the sideboard, sir," Tom admitted, his voice barely audible. Poirot clapped his hands together, startling the room. "Voila! The detail, it emerges. A dropped spoon, a distraction, and in that moment the poison finds its way. But to whom was it meant? Mrs. Poole or another?" Lady Beatrice's hand tightened on her pendant. "You suggest the poison was not meant for her." "It is possible, madame. The decanter was tainted, yet only one glass killed. This is not chance. It is design." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "I shall examine this spoon, this tray, this sideboard. The truth, it lies in such trifles." As the group dispersed, Poirot led Hastings to the great hall, where the sideboard stood, its surface polished, but now cordoned off by the police. He knelt, examining the floor, and found a small silver spoon, its handle slightly bent. "Hastings," he said, holding it up, "this spoon, it is not merely dropped, it is placed, perhaps, to draw attention. And look, there is a faint scratch on the sideboard, as if something heavy was moved." Hastings leaned closer. "A glass, you think, or the decanter?" "Poirot, perhaps," he said, "but it tells us that someone was here in that critical moment. We must reconstruct the scene, Hastings. The spoon, the tray, the glass, they are the keys to the mind of the murderer."
Chapter 7. More Lies. Surface.
The evening of October 16th, 1928, deepened the oppressive atmosphere within Ashenby Hall, where the murder of Mrs. Poole continued to cast a shadow over its inhabitants. The great house, with its ancient timbers and flickering lamps, seemed to pulse with secrets, each creak of the floorboards a whisper of hidden truths. Hercule Poirot, his mind as sharp as the polished silver spoon he had examined earlier, sat in the drawing-room, his green eyes scanning the faces of the gathered guests. The clock on the mantel read 8:30 p.m., its relentless ticking a reminder that time was peeling away the layers of deception. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by Poirot's side, his notebook filled with meticulous records of the day's discoveries, the marked book, the bent spoon, the scratched sideboard, and the faint traces of cyanide in the sherry decanter. Yet it was Poirot's latest focus, the subtle contradictions in the guests' alibis, that promised to unravel the mystery further. Hastings knew his friend was closing in on something, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of innocence presented by the household. Poirot rose, his small frame commanding the room's attention. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice soft but piercing, "the murder of Mrs. Poole is no simple act of violence. It is a crime of calculation, woven with lies that now begin to fray. Each of you has spoken of your actions at 8:55 p.m., yet there are inconsistencies. Small, yes, but significant. Let us explore these threads, for they lead to the heart of the matter." Lady Beatrice Vane, seated by the fire, her crescent moon pendant catching the light, fixed Poirot with a steady gaze. "Monsieur Poirot, I have told you all I know. Mrs. Poole was a trusted servant. I cannot imagine who would wish her harm." Poirot inclined his head. "And yet, madame, your household is not without its tensions. Your nephew, Monsieur Rupert, has returned after years abroad, seeking funds, perhaps, and you, I understand, have been reconsidering your will. Did Mrs. Poole know of these matters?" Lady Beatrice's lips tightened, but she answered calmly. "Mrs. Poole was privy to many household affairs, as any good housekeeper would be. My will is my own concern, but I assure you it had no bearing on her death." Rupert Vane, pacing near the window, snorted. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Poirot. If you're suggesting I'd kill the housekeeper over money, you're mad. I was at the table eating when she screamed. Ask Dr. Hayworth. He was right across from me." Dr. Hayworth nodded, though his eyes flickered with unease. "As I've said, I was discussing the cider with Rupert. I saw nothing unusual." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And yet, doctor, your glass of wine was nearly full when the cry came, though you claim to have been sipping it. A small detail, but curious. And you, Madame Wen," he turned to the vicar's wife, "you insist you were speaking with Mademoiselle Finch about the choir, yet your prayer book, it was closed on the table, not open as one might expect during such a pious discussion." Mrs. Clara Wren flushed, her hands clutching the book. I may have set it down. It was a casual conversation, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you don't suspect me?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "I suspect only the truth, madame. And you, Mademoiselle Finch," he turned to the nervous companion, "you confirm Madame Wen's account, yet your eyes, they tell a different story. You were upset, perhaps, before the cry?" Elisa Finch's hands twisted in her apron, her voice barely audible. I was worried about the supper, that's all. I wanted everything to be perfect for Lady Beatrice." Poirot's gaze lingered on her, then shifted to Tom Briggs, the footman, who stood rigid by the door. "Monsieur Briggs, you admitted to a moment's distraction. A dropped spoon, yes, but tell me, did you see anyone near the sideboard after you picked it up?" Tom's face paled. "No, sir, I swear. I was back at my post right away. I didn't see nobody." Poirot nodded, then turned to the group. "There is a lie here, mes amis, and it grows heavier with each denial. Let us consider another matter. The notebook found in Mrs. Poole's room. It contains entries. R.V. asks for funds, refused. L.B. speaks of will. E.F. upset, seen in garden. These are not mere jottings. They are glimpses into the secrets of this house." A gasp escaped Miss Finch, her eyes wide with panic. I don't know what she meant by that. I was in the garden that morning, yes, but I was just walking. I wasn't upset." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the room. "Elisa, call him yourself. Mrs. Poole was observant, that is all. She noted many things in her duties." But Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, madame, and one of those things was a feud, perhaps, or a secret that someone feared she would reveal. Let us speak of the garden, Miss Finch. What were you doing there at, say, 7 a.m. yesterday morning?" Elisa's hands trembled. I was picking flowers for the supper table. Mrs. Poole asked me to. That's all." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "And yet her notebook suggests you were upset. Did you see something or someone in the garden? Perhaps Monsieur Rupert or Dr. Haworth?" Rupert laughed sharply. "Me in the garden at dawn? I was still in bed, Poirot. You're grasping at straws." Dr. Haworth cleared his throat. "I was in my room preparing for the day. I had no reason to be in the garden." Poirot's gaze returned to Elisa, his voice gentle but insistent. "Mademoiselle, the truth, it is a burden, yes, but it is better to share it now than to let it fester." Elisa's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands. I saw them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mrs. Poole and Dr. Haworth. They were arguing in the garden, near the rose arbor. I didn't hear much, but she was angry, saying something about betrayal and the family. I didn't want to eavesdrop, so I left." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Dr. Haworth, whose face had gone ashen. He said, "That's preposterous. I never argued with Mrs. Poole. Miss Finch must be mistaken." Poirot's smile was almost imperceptible. "Mistaken, doctor? Or perhaps you have forgotten. The garden, it is a private place, yet not so private that a housekeeper and a doctor cannot be seen. What was this betrayal she spoke of?" Haworth's hands clenched. "I tell you it didn't happen. I was not in the garden." Mrs. Wren interjected, her voice shrill. "This is what comes of meddling in pagan nonsense. Mrs. Poole was too fond of those old stories, and now look what's happened." Poirot turned to her, his tone sharp. "Madame, the stories of the stone circle are not our concern. The lies, however, they are. And you too have been less than forthcoming. Your prayer book closed at 8:55 p.m. Why? Were you truly discussing the choir or something else?" Mrs. Wren's cheeks reddened. "I resent your implication, Monsieur Poirot. I am a woman of faith." "And faith," Poirot said softly, "can be a mask for many things." He turned to the group, his voice rising. "The lies, they surface now. An argument in the garden, a will under discussion, a refusal of funds. Each of you hides something, but Hercule Poirot will find it. Tomorrow we shall reconstruct the evening once more, and the truth will no longer hide." As the clock struck 9 p.m., the drawing-room emptied, leaving Poirot and Hastings alone. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls, and Hastings felt a chill. The lies were surfacing, but the truth remained just out of reach, hidden in the intricate dance of motives and alibis.
Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The night of October 16, 1928, had settled heavily over Ashenby Hall, its darkened corridors echoing with the weight of unspoken truths. The murder of Mrs. Poole, now a day old, had frayed the nerves of the household, and the guests, confined under Inspector Grayson's orders, moved through the great house like ghosts, their faces etched with fear and suspicion. The clock in the drawing room struck 10 p.m., its chime a somber note in the tense silence that followed Hercule Poirot's latest revelations. Captain Arthur Hastings sat near the fire, his notebook open but untouched, his mind racing with the day's developments. Poirot's probing had uncovered a crack in the facade of the household. Miss Eliza Finch's tearful admission of an argument between Mrs. Poole and Dr. Haworth in the garden, a confrontation marked by the word betrayal. The notebook entries, the bent spoon, the scratched sideboard, all pointed to a web of secrets, but it was the emotional weight of Eliza's confession that had shifted the investigation. Hastings knew Poirot was poised to exploit this crack, to press until the truth broke free. Poirot stood before the assembled guests, his small frame radiating a quiet intensity. Lady Beatrice Vane sat rigidly by the fireplace, her crescent moon pendant glinting in the lamplight. Rupert Vane leaned against the wall, his cigarette case snapping open and shut with nervous rhythm. Dr. Haworth's face was pale, his hands clasped tightly, while Mrs. Clara Wren clutched her prayer book, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Eliza Finch, her eyes red from crying, sat hunched on a sofa, and Tom Briggs, the footman, stood by the door, his youthful face taut with anxiety. "Mesdames and messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm but laden with purpose. "The death of Mrs. Poole is a tragedy, but it is also a mirror reflecting the secrets of this house. Last evening, Mademoiselle Finch revealed a truth. A heated exchange between Mrs. Poole and Dr. Haworth in the garden. A word spoken. Betrayal. This word, it is a key, unlocking motives we have yet to fully understand. I ask you now to speak plainly, for the time of half-truths is past." Dr. Haworth rose, his voice sharp with indignation. "Monsieur Poirot, I have denied this accusation, and I stand by it. I was not in the garden with Mrs. Poole. Miss Finch is mistaken, or perhaps confused, by her own distress." Eliza's head snapped up, her voice trembling but defiant. "I'm not mistaken, doctor. I saw you, near the rose arbor, at 7 in the morning. Mrs. Poole was angry. She raised her voice, something she never did. I heard her say, 'Betrayal,' and you told her to keep quiet. I ran away because I didn't want to hear more." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. Lady Beatrice's hand tightened on her pendant, her eyes narrowing. "Eliza, why did you not mention this sooner? Mrs. Poole was my housekeeper, my confidant. If she was troubled, I should have known." Eliza's tears spilled over, her voice breaking. "I was afraid, Lady Beatrice. Mrs. Poole told me to stay out of it, said it was a private matter. I thought it wasn't my place. But now she's dead, and I can't bear it." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Poirot's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Mademoiselle, your courage, it is admirable. This truth, it is painful, but it brings us closer to justice. Dr. Haworth, will you continue to deny this meeting?" Haworth's face twitched, his composure cracking. "Very well," he said, his voice low. "I was in the garden. Mrs. Poole approached me, accusing me of disloyalty to the Vane family. She had overheard a conversation I had with a colleague in Netherby about a consultation I provided for Lady Beatrice's health. Mrs. Poole thought I was sharing private matters, but I assure you it was professional, nothing more. I told her to keep quiet, as it was no concern of hers. Lady Beatrice's voice was icy. And was it, Doctor, no concern of hers? Mrs. Poole was devoted to this house. If she suspected you of indiscretion, she had every right to question you. Haworth's hands clenched. It was a misunderstanding. Nothing more. I had no reason to harm her. Poirot's mustache twitched. A misunderstanding, Doctor, or a motive. Mrs. Poole, she knew much of this household. Perhaps she knew too much. He turned to Rupert Vane, who had stopped pacing, his eyes wary. Monsieur Vane, the notebook mentioned your request for funds refused by your aunt. Did Mrs. Poole know your financial troubles? Did she, perhaps, threaten to reveal them? Rupert's laugh was bitter. You're relentless, Poirot. Yes, I asked Aunt Beatrice for money. Who wouldn't with an estate like this? Mrs. Poole might have known, but I didn't care. She was just the housekeeper. Why would I kill her over that? Poirot's gaze shifted to Mrs. Wren. And you, madame, you speak of faith, yet your prayer book was closed at the critical moment. Were you truly discussing the choir, or were you watching the sideboard, perhaps aware of something amiss? Miss Wren's cheeks flushed. I resent your tone, Monsieur Poirot. I was with Miss Finch, as I've said. I saw nothing near the sideboard. Poirot nodded, then turned to Tom Briggs. Monsieur Briggs, the dropped spoon, a convenient distraction. Did you drop it, or was it placed to draw your attention? Tom's face reddened. I don't know, sir. It was on the floor, by the tray. I just picked it up. Poirot's eyes gleamed, and in that moment someone moved. The sideboard was scratched, the decanter tampered with. Someone in this room seized that opportunity. The lies, they crumble now. Mademoiselle Finch has shown us the way, but there is more to uncover. I ask you to search your memories, your consciences. What did you see at 8:59 p.m.? What did you hear? The room was thick with tension, the guests' faces pale and strained. Eliza's sobs had quieted, but her revelation had shaken the group, exposing fissures in their carefully crafted alibis. Hastings, watching closely, noticed Rupert's fingers tremble as he lit another cigarette, and Mrs. Wren's prayer book slipped from her grasp, landing with a soft thud. Poirot stepped closer to Eliza, his voice gentle. Mademoiselle, you have been brave. But tell me, did Mrs. Poole ever speak of the stone circle or the pendant Lady Beatrice wears? Eliza hesitated, her eyes darting to Lady Beatrice. She said it was a heavy burden, like I told you. She didn't believe in the curse, but she said the past weighed on the family. She was worried for Lady Beatrice, especially after Rupert came back. Lady Beatrice's expression softened, a rare vulnerability flickering in her eyes. Mrs. Poole was loyal to a fault. She knew the history of the Vanes, our triumphs, our mistakes. If she was worried, it was for my sake. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The past, it is a shadow over this house. But it is the present we must face. Tomorrow, we shall gather again, and I shall lay a trap for the truth. For now, rest, if you can. As the guests dispersed, their footsteps heavy, Hastings approached Poirot. You pushed them hard, Poirot. Eliza's breakdown, it's opened up something.
Do you think Hayworth's hiding more than a professional indiscretion?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Mon ami, the good doctor is a man of secrets, but so are they all. Eliza's truth has cracked the shell, but the kernel of the mystery remains. The pendant, the notebook, the argument, they point to a motive tied to this family's history. Tomorrow we shall see who falters next." As the clock struck 10:30 p.m., the drawing-room emptied, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Hastings felt a surge.
Chapter 9. The Trap. The morning of October 17th, 1928, broke with a chill that seeped into the bones of Ashenby Hall, as if the house itself mourned the loss of Mrs. Poole. The mist had returned, curling around the stone circle on the hill and shrouding the manor in a ghostly veil. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, the guests' faces drawn with sleeplessness and dread. Hercule Poirot, ever precise in his black suit and polished shoes, stood in the great hall, his green eyes gleaming with purpose. The clock read 10 a.m., and the stage was set for what he called the trap, a moment designed to unsettle the guilty and coax the truth into the light. Captain Arthur Hastings, standing by the sideboard where the fateful sherry decanter had stood, felt a familiar thrill. Poirot's methods, though theatrical, were rooted in an unerring understanding of human nature. The emotional weight of Miss Eliza Finch's revelation the previous night, her witnessing an argument between Mrs. Poole and Dr. Hayworth, had cracked the facade of the household. Now, Poirot was ready to apply pressure, to exploit the fraying nerves of the suspects and force a misstep. The guests were gathered in the great hall, seated at the long oak table as they had been during the harvest supper. Lady Beatrice Vane presided at the head, her crescent moon pendant catching the light, her expression one of steely resolve. Rupert Vane slouched to her right, his cigarette case untouched for once, his eyes darting nervously. Dr. Hayworth sat opposite, his hands folded, but his knuckles white. Miss Clara Wren clutched her prayer book, her lips moving silently, while Miss Eliza Finch, pale and subdued, kept her gaze on her lap. Tom Briggs stood by the door, his youthful face taut, as Inspector Grayson and his constable watched from the sidelines. Poirot stepped forward, his small frame commanding the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice clear and deliberate, "the murder of Mrs. Poole is a crime of precision, yet it is also a crime of passion, of secrets held too long. Last night, Mademoiselle Finch revealed a truth, an argument in the garden, a word spoken, betrayal. Today we shall peel back another layer. I propose to recreate the moments before the cry at 9 p.m., but with a difference. I ask you to speak not only of your actions, but of your thoughts, your feelings. The heart, it betrays what the tongue conceals." A murmur of unease rippled through the group. Rupert leaned forward, his voice sharp. "This is ridiculous, Poirot. We've told you where we were. What more do you want? Our dreams?" Poirot's smile was thin. "Not your dreams, Monsieur Vane, but your motives. Let us begin. At 8:55 p.m., the dessert was served. The spoon was dropped, the sherry decanter stood on the sideboard. Who among you felt anger, fear, or desperation in that moment?" Lady Beatrice's voice was cold. "Monsieur Poirot, this is a private matter. My household is not a stage for your theatrics." "Forgive me, madame," Poirot said, bowing slightly, "but murder, it makes all things public. You, I believe, were thinking of your family's legacy, perhaps of the pendant at your throat. Did Mrs. Poole's knowledge of your plans, your will perhaps, cause you unease?" Lady Beatrice's hand flew to the pendant, her eyes flashing. Mrs. Poole was loyal.
She knew my intentions for the estate and respected them. I had no reason to fear her. Poirot nodded, turning to Rupert. And you, Monsieur Vane, you who sought funds from your aunt, who stands to inherit this estate, did you resent Mrs. Poole's influence over Lady Beatrice? Rupert's jaw tightened. I've said it before. I didn't care about the housekeeper. I was eating, laughing, like everyone else. I wasn't thinking about her at all. Poirot's gaze shifted to Dr. Haworth. Doctor, you admitted to an argument with Mrs. Poole about betrayal. At 8:55 p.m., were you thinking of that conversation? Were you afraid she would reveal something to Lady Beatrice? Haworth's face hardened. I was thinking of the cider, as I told you. Mrs. Poole's accusations were a misunderstanding. I had no reason to fear her or harm her. Miss Wren spoke up, her voice shrill. Monsieur Poirot, this is unseemly. I was thinking of the choir, of my duties to the church. I had no part in this wickedness. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, madame, your prayer book was closed. Were you truly so absorbed in piety, or were you watching the sideboard, perhaps aware of a movement? Miss Wren gasped, her cheeks reddening. I saw nothing. I was with Miss Finch. Eliza Finch flinched, her voice barely audible. I was thinking about the supper, about making Lady Beatrice proud. I didn't notice anything. Poirot turned to Tom Briggs. And you, Monsieur Briggs? The spoon, it fell, and you bent to retrieve it. What were you thinking in that moment? Were you distracted by something or someone? Tom's face flushed. I was just doing my job, sir. I thought the maid might get in trouble for dropping the spoon, so I picked it up. That's all. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Voilà! The thoughts, they reveal much, yet they hide more. But let us test them. I have a theory, mes amis. The poison was in the decanter, yet only Mrs. Poole died. Suppose the glass was prepared, marked perhaps for another. Suppose someone placed it in her hand, knowing she would drink. A gasp escaped Miss Finch, her hands flying to her mouth. The others froze, their eyes wide. Poirot continued, his voice relentless. I propose a test. We shall place glasses on the sideboard, as they were that night. Each of you will choose a glass, as you did during the supper. If one is marked or different, we shall see. Inspector Grayson, intrigued despite himself, agreed to the experiment. The sideboard was cleared, and 6 identical crystal glasses were set out, filled with water, to mimic the sherry. Poirot instructed each guest to select a glass, as they would have during the supper, while Hastings and Grayson watched closely. Lady Beatrice chose first, her hand steady as she took a glass from the left. Rupert hesitated, then grabbed one from the center, his fingers trembling slightly. Dr. Haworth selected a glass with deliberate care, inspecting it before taking it. Miss Wren snatched hers quickly, her eyes darting to Poirot. Eliza Finch, trembling, took the nearest glass, nearly dropping it. Tom Briggs, last, picked one from the right, his face pale. Poirot examined each glass, holding them to the light. Most curious, he murmured, pausing at Rupert's glass. This one, it has a faint scratch on the rim, a mark, perhaps, to distinguish it. Monsieur Vane, did you choose this glass by chance or by design? Rupert's eyes widened. I just picked one. I didn't notice any scratch. Poirot's gaze swept the group. The scratch, it is subtle, but it is there. Was this glass meant for another, perhaps for Lady Beatrice, or even for you, Monsieur Vane? Mrs. Poole, she took it by mistake, perhaps, and paid the price. Lady Beatrice's voice was sharp. Are you suggesting the poison was meant for me, Monsieur Poirot? It is possible, madame, or for your nephew. The motive, it lies in the secrets of this house. Debts, wills, betrayals. Someone here knows the truth. The room erupted in protests, but Poirot raised a hand. Enough. The trap, it is set. The guilty one, they feel the pressure now. Tomorrow we shall gather again, and I shall name the murderer. Reflect, mes amis, on your actions, your thoughts. The truth cannot hide forever." As the guests dispersed, their faces pale and strained, Hastings leaned toward Poirot. "That was bold, Poirot. The scratched glass, do you really think it was marked for someone else?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The glass, it is a clue, Hastings, but also a provocation. The murderer, they are clever, but they are human. They will make a mistake now under this pressure. The trap, it is not the glass. It is the fear of being seen." As the clock struck 11 a.m., the great hall emptied, leaving only the echo of Poirot's words. Hastings felt a chill, knowing that the trap had been sprung, and the murderer, whoever it was now cornered, their next move critical to Poirot's plan.
Chapter 10. The Reveal. The morning of October 18th, 1928, dawned with a brittle clarity over St. Mary's Hollow. The mist that had cloaked Ashenby Hall for days finally parting to reveal a pale, cold sun. The great house stood silent, its stone walls bearing witness to the tension that had built within. The murder of Mrs. Poole, now 2 days past, had woven a web of suspicion and fear among the guests, and Hercule Poirot's trap, set the previous day, had left them restless, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The clock in the great hall struck 11 a.m., its chime a solemn call to the gathering Poirot had promised would unveil the truth. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the tall windows, his notebook clutched tightly, his heart pounding with anticipation. Poirot's experiment with the glasses, revealing a scratched rim on Rupert Vane's selection, had stirred the household, planting seeds of doubt and fear. Hastings knew his friend's methods, meticulous, psychological, relentless, and he sensed that the moment of revelation was at hand. The guests, summoned to the great hall, took their places at the long oak table, their faces pale and strained. Inspector Grayson and his constable stood by the door, ready to act on Poirot's conclusions. Poirot entered, his small frame immaculate in a black suit, his mustache perfectly waxed, his green eyes alight with the fire of certainty. He stood at the head of the table opposite Lady Beatrice Vane, whose crescent moon pendant gleamed against her dark gown. Rupert Vane sat to her right, his hands fidgeting, his cigarette case abandoned. Dr. Hayworth's lean face was taut, his eyes fixed on Poirot. Mrs. Clara Wren clutched her prayer book, her knuckles white, while Miss Eliza Finch, subdued and tearful, kept her gaze on the table. Tom Briggs, the footman, stood rigidly by the sideboard, his youthful features drawn. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice clear and commanding, "the murder of Mrs. Poole is a crime of cunning, designed to deceive. But Hercule Poirot does not yield to deception. The truth, it lies in the details. The glass, the spoon, the notebook, the argument, the pendant. Today, I shall unravel this tapestry and name the murderer." A hush fell over the room, the guests' eyes wide with dread. Lady Beatrice's voice was steady but cold. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust you have evidence to support your claims. This house has suffered enough." He bowed slightly. "Madame, the evidence is clear, and it points to one among you. Let us reconstruct the crime step by step and see how the pieces fit." He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. On the night of October 15th, at 9 p.m., a cry was heard from the library. Mrs. Poole was found dead, poisoned by cyanide in a sherry glass that bore only her fingerprints. The decanter contained traces of cyanide, yet none of you who drank from it were harmed. How is this possible? Rupert leaned forward,
his voice sharp. "You said it yourself, Poirot. The glass was meant for someone else. Mrs. Poole took it by mistake." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A good theory, Monsieur Vane, but incomplete. Let us consider the timeline. At 8:59 p.m., the dessert was served and a spoon was dropped near the sideboard, distracting Monsieur Briggs. In that moment, someone tampered with a glass, not the decanter. The cyanide was added to a specific glass, marked with a scratch, as we discovered yesterday. But who marked it, and for whom?" He turned to the sideboard, gesturing to its polished surface. "The scratch on the sideboard, it tells us a glass was moved, perhaps set aside for a purpose. The notebook in Mrs. Poole's room spoke of tensions. Ende, RV asks for funds. Refused. Ende, LB speaks of will. Ende, EF, upset, seen in the garden. And then Mademoiselle Finch revealed an argument in the garden, where Mrs. Poole accused Dr. Haworth of betrayal. These are not random details. They are the threads of motive." Dr. Haworth's face tightened. "I've explained that argument, Poirot. It was a misunderstanding about a professional matter. I had no reason to kill her." Poirot's smile was thin. "Perhaps, Doctor, but let us explore another possibility. The pendant of Lady Beatrice, this crescent moon, it is tied to the stone circle, to the Vane family's history. Mrs. Poole, she knew of this history, and she worried for her mistress. She knew of disputes over the will, over the estate. And she knew something else, something that made her a threat." Lady Beatrice touched her pendant, her eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Poole was loyal, Monsieur Poirot. She would never betray me." "Indeed, madame, but loyalty can be a burden. Let us consider the glass again. It bore only Mrs. Poole's fingerprints, yet she was not a drinker. Someone placed it in her hand or ensured she took it. Why? To silence her or to cover a greater crime?" Poirot turned to the sideboard, his voice sharp. "Monsieur Briggs, you were by the sideboard when the spoon fell. You admitted to looking away. But tell me, did you see anyone take a glass before the supper began?" Tom's face flushed, his voice trembling. I don't know, sir. It was busy, with the maids setting up. I didn't notice." Poirot's gaze shifted to Miss Finch, whose hands twisted in her lap. "Mademoiselle Finch, you were in the garden. You saw the argument. Did Mrs. Poole ever speak of a specific threat to Lady Beatrice?" Eliza's eyes filled with tears. She said someone was trying to hurt Lady Beatrice, to take the estate. She didn't say who, but she was afraid. She told me to watch Rupert, to be careful." Rupert's fist slammed on the table. "That's a lie, Poirot. You're letting this girl's hysterics lead you astray." Poirot raised a hand. "Calm yourself, Monsieur Vane. The truth is near. Let us consider the motive. The estate, it is the heart of this crime. Lady Beatrice, you have no children, and Rupert is your heir. But Mrs. Poole, she knew of your plans to change your will, did she not?" Lady Beatrice's face paled, but she nodded. "Yes, I discussed it with her, yes. I intended to leave a portion to charity, to preserve the stone circle as a historical site. Rupert would still inherit, but less than he expected." Rupert's eyes widened. "You can't be serious, Aunt Beatrice. You'd give away my inheritance for some old stones?" Poirot's voice cut through the tension. "And here we find the motive. Mrs. Poole knew of this change, and someone feared she would reveal it. But there is more. The glass, it was meant for Lady Beatrice, not Mrs. Poole. The murderer marked it, placed it on the sideboard, expecting Lady Beatrice to take it during the supper. But Mrs. Poole, ever vigilant,
took the glass, perhaps to test it, perhaps by mistake, and paid with her life." A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Wren's prayer book fell to the floor. "You mean someone tried to kill Lady Beatrice?" she whispered. "Precisely," Poirot said, "and the murderer is among us." He turned to Dr. Haworth, his voice relentless. "Doctor, you have knowledge of poisons. You argued with Mrs. Poole about betrayal. You were near the sideboard, and you knew of Lady Beatrice's health consultations. You feared Mrs. Poole would expose a secret, perhaps that you were advising against the will's change, or worse, that you had a stake in the estate's future." Haworth's face contorted. "That's absurd, Poirot. I'm a doctor, not a murderer." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then let us test the truth. The scratched glass, it was yours, doctor. You marked it, knowing Lady Beatrice would take it. But Mrs. Poole, she suspected you. She took the glass to protect her mistress, and in doing so, she died." A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Wren's prayer book fell to the floor. "You mean someone tried to kill Lady Beatrice?" she whispered. "Precisely," Poirot said, "and the murderer is among us." He turned to Dr. Haworth, his voice relentless. "Doctor, you have knowledge of poisons. You argued with Mrs. Poole about betrayal. You were near the sideboard, and you knew of Lady Beatrice's health consultations. You feared Mrs. Poole would expose a secret, perhaps that you were advising against the will's change, or worse, that you had a stake in the estate's future."
Chapter 11. The Reflection. The afternoon of October 18th, 1928, cast a somber light over Ashenby Hall, the pale sun filtering through the tall windows of the drawing-room. The revelation of Dr. Haworth's guilt had left the household in a state of quiet shock, as if the air itself mourned the betrayal uncovered by Hercule Poirot's relentless logic. The great house, once vibrant with the bustle of the harvest supper, now felt hollow, its corridors echoing with the weight of Mrs. Poole's sacrifice and the truth that had finally emerged. The clock on the mantel read 2 p.m., its steady ticking a reminder that time, like Poirot's mind, moved forward with unyielding precision. Captain Arthur Hastings sat by the fire, his notebook closed, his thoughts a tangle of awe and melancholy. Poirot's revelation in the great hall had been a masterstroke, weaving together the threads of the scratched glass, the notebook, the garden argument, and the crescent moon pendant to expose Dr. Haworth's attempt to murder Lady Beatrice. Mrs. Poole's death, an unintended consequence of a poisoned glass meant for her mistress, had been both a tragedy and a testament to her loyalty. Now, as the dust settled, Hastings knew Poirot would turn to reflection, to the philosophy that always followed his triumphs. Poirot stood by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the gray sky, his hands clasped behind his back. The guests had dispersed, Lady Beatrice to her private study, Rupert Vane to his room under police supervision, Mrs. Clara Wren to the village church, Miss Eliza Finch to her duties, and Tom Briggs to the servants' quarters. Inspector Grayson had taken Dr. Haworth to Netherby for formal questioning, leaving Poirot and Hastings alone in the drawing-room. "Mon ami," Poirot said, turning to Hastings, his voice soft but resonant. "The case is solved, yet the heart remains heavy. The death of Mrs. Poole, it was a crime of greed and desperation, but also of miscalculation. The human soul, it is a complex thing, n'est-ce pas? It seeks to control fate, yet fate, it has its own design." Hastings nodded, his brow furrowed. "You were brilliant, Poirot. The way you pieced it together, the glass, the spoon, the notebook, the garden argument, and the crescent moon pendant, to expose Dr. Haworth's attempt to murder Lady Beatrice.
Mrs. Poole's death, an unintended consequence of a poisoned glass meant for her mistress, had been both a tragedy and a testament to her loyalty. Now, as the dust settled, Hastings knew Poirot would turn to reflection, to the philosophy that always followed his triumphs. Poirot stood by the window, his small frame silhouetted against the gray sky, his hands clasped behind his back. The guests had dispersed, Lady Beatrice to her private study, Rupert Vane to his room under police supervision, Mrs. Clara Wren to the village church, Miss Eliza Finch to her duties, and Tom Briggs to the servants' quarters. Inspector Grayson had taken Dr. Haworth to Netherby for formal questioning, leaving Poirot and Hastings alone in the drawing-room. "Mon ami," Poirot said, turning to Hastings, his voice soft but resonant. "The case is solved, yet the heart remains heavy. The death of Mrs. Poole, it was a crime of greed and desperation, but also of miscalculation. The human soul, it is a complex thing, n'est-ce pas? It seeks to control fate, yet fate, it has its own design." Hastings nodded, his brow furrowed. "You were brilliant, Poirot, the way you pieced it together, the glass, the spoon, the notebook, the garden argument, and the crescent moon pendant." Poirot's mustache twitched in a faint smile. "The little gray cells, Hastings, they see the pattern where others see only chaos. The key was the glass, marked with a scratch. It was not random, but deliberate, meant for Lady Beatrice. Dr. Haworth, he had the knowledge of poisons, the access to the sideboard, and the motive, fear that Mrs. Poole would expose his collusion with Rupert Vane to secure the estate. The argument in the garden, it was the final clue. Mrs. Poole suspected him, and he acted to silence her, not knowing she would take the fatal glass herself." Hastings shook his head. "Poor Mrs. Poole. She died protecting her mistress, without even knowing it." "Oui," Poirot said, his eyes distant. "Her loyalty, it was her strength and her undoing. She saw the danger to Lady Beatrice, perhaps in the marked glass, and took it to test or remove it. The murderer, he did not anticipate such devotion. It is a lesson, Hastings. The heart, it can be more powerful than the mind, yet it is the mind that must prevail to uncover the truth." He moved to the fireplace, his gaze falling on the portrait of a stern-faced Vane ancestor above the mantel. "This house, it carries the weight of history, the stone circle, the pendant, the curse. These are not mere superstitions, but symbols of human fear and ambition. Lady Beatrice, she clings to her pendant, to the past, yet it nearly cost her life. Dr. Haworth, he saw the estate as a prize, and Rupert, he saw it as his salvation. But Mrs. Poole, she saw only her duty." Hastings leaned forward. "And the pendant, you kept mentioning it. Was it just a distraction, or did it mean something?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The pendant, it was a symbol, Hastings, but also a clue to motive. Lady Beatrice's intention to preserve the stone circle, to give part of her estate to charity. It threatened Rupert's inheritance and Dr. Haworth's plans. The pendant, it reminded Mrs. Poole of the family's history, of the burdens Lady Beatrice carried. She noted these tensions in her notebook, and it cost her life." He paused, his voice softening. "The human heart, it is swayed by such symbols, by love, by greed, by loyalty. Hercule Poirot, he does not believe in curses, but he believes in the power of belief. It drives men to murder and women to sacrifice." Hastings sighed. "It's a grim business, Poirot. Do you ever tire of it, uncovering these dark corners of human nature?" Poirot turned, his expression solemn but resolute. "Tire, mon ami? Never. The truth, it is a light in the darkness. To find it, to bring justice, it is the purpose of Hercule Poirot. Each case, it teaches us something of the soul, of its flaws, its strengths. Mrs. Poole, she reminds us that loyalty, it is a noble thing, even when it leads to tragedy." He glanced at his watch, then at the door. "Come, Hastings, our work here is done. Lady Beatrice will mourn, but she will endure. The police, they will handle the rest. We shall return to London, where, no doubt, another puzzle awaits." Hastings rose, gathering his coat. "Are you sure there's nothing more to uncover? No loose ends?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "There are always loose ends, Hastings, but in this case the essential truth is clear. Dr. Haworth sought to kill Lady Beatrice to secure the estate's future, perhaps in league with Rupert, though his full complicity remains for the courts. Mrs. Poole's death was a tragic error, but it revealed the murderer's hand. The little gray cells, they have done their work." As they stepped into the entrance hall, Lady Beatrice appeared, her face pale but composed. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady, "I owe you my thanks and my life. Mrs. Poole, she was more than a servant, she was a friend. I shall see that her memory is honored." Poirot bowed deeply. "Madame, it is enough that justice is served. Keep your pendant, your history, but let it be a reminder of those who serve you with loyalty. Adieu." As they stepped outside, the cold air greeted them, and the stone circle loomed on the hill, silent and eternal. Hastings glanced back at the manor, its windows glowing faintly. "Do you think the curse is real, Poirot? The goddess, the stones?" Poirot chuckled softly. "The only curse, Hastings, is the greed and fear that dwell in the human heart. But come, the train awaits, and Hercule Poirot has no patience for late departures." As they walked down the gravel path, the clock struck 2:30 p.m., and the great house faded into the mist, its secrets laid bare by the relentless logic of the little Belgian detective.